By September 1943, the Pacific War had reached a critical turning point. America was winning, but the victory was far from guaranteed. Every battle cost lives. Every operation required sacrifice. The Japanese were not just losing ground, they were losing the psychological war as well. But their refusal to surrender meant the conflict would continue for months, possibly years. The symbol of Japanese air superiority was unmistakable: the Mitsubishi A6M0. This aircraft was legendary. American pilots respected it. American pilots feared it. In the early days of the war, when American fighters first encountered the Zero, the results were catastrophic. American pilots were dying at a rate that shocked military leadership. The Zero could turn tighter than anything America had in the sky. It could climb faster. It could maneuver in ways that American pilots had never seen before. But by 1943, something had shifted. American pilots had learned. American tactics had evolved. American aircraft design had improved. The pilots who survived their first encounters with the Zero had lived to teach others. Gradually, incrementally, American air superiority over the Pacific grew stronger. But the military leadership wanted more than just tactical improvements. They wanted something revolutionary. It was during this period of strategic calculation that an American patrol discovered something that would change everything. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, hidden among the dense vegetation and the wreckage of war, American soldiers found a Japanese Zero fighter. The aircraft was damaged, but surprisingly intact. The Japanese had abandoned it during their retreat, leaving behind a technological prize that American engineers had been dreaming about since the first day of the war. The moment this aircraft arrived at the American air base, engineers descended on it like vultures on a carcass. Every panel was removed, every circuit was examined, every system was documented. For the first time in the war, American engineers had the opportunity to study the Zero, not as an enemy to be fought, but as a machine to be understood. Among those who studied this captured aircraft was a man named Captain William Coller. Coller was not like other officers. He had grown up around aviation. His family was obsessed with flight. His mind worked differently than most military strategists. Where other officers saw the captured Zero as a source of technical intelligence, Coller saw something far more radical: an opportunity to fundamentally change the nature of air combat in the Pacific. Coller's idea, when he first proposed it to his superiors, was considered insane. The idea was simple. What if American pilots learned to fly the Zero? What if they mastered Japanese aircraft to such a degree that they could fly them in combat? What if American pilots could infiltrate Japanese formations without being immediately detected? The reaction was predictable. Officers laughed. Strategists dismissed it as too dangerous. The risks seemed to outweigh any potential benefits. But Coller persisted. He wrote memorandums. He lobbied senior commanders. He presented data showing how American pilots had already proven they could adapt to different aircraft. He argued that if American pilots could understand the Zero at an intuitive level, they could predict Japanese tactical movements before they happened. Months passed. Coller's proposal gathered dust in filing cabinets and offices. But then something shifted. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Supreme Commander of the Pacific Fleet, read Coller's proposal. Nimitz was not bound by conventional military thinking. Nimitz understood that innovation could change wars. Nimitz understood that sometimes the craziest ideas were the only ideas that could work. In November 1943, Nimitz gave Coller the approval he needed. Operation Fehler was officially born. The name, deliberately obscure, meant nothing to those who saw it in classified documents. But those who knew what Fehler meant understood that they were about to attempt something that had never been done before in the history of aerial warfare. Coller knew exactly what kind of pilots he needed. They couldn't be ordinary flyers. They couldn't be pilots who would panic when things went wrong. They needed to be exceptional. They needed to be men who could think clearly when chaos erupted around them. They needed to be pilots who could adapt, who could learn, who could accept the fact that if anything went wrong, if they were captured wearing enemy uniforms while flying enemy aircraft, they could be executed as spies. The first pilot Coller selected was Lieutenant James Mills. Mills had already flown 30 combat missions. He had already shot down 4 confirmed Japanese aircraft. More importantly, Mills possessed a quality that couldn't be taught or trained. He possessed natural leadership. Other pilots followed Mills instinctively. When Mills was in command, men trusted that he had calculated the risks and determined that the mission was worth the cost. Mills was calm, Mills was capable. Mills was exactly what Koller needed, leading this dangerous operation. The second pilot was Captain Robert Hampson. Hampson was different from Mills. Where Mills was cerebral and careful, Hampson was intuitive and aggressive. Hampson could feel an aircraft the way a musician feels his instrument. He could sense the slightest change in engine performance. He could predict an enemy's movements before the enemy himself knew what he was going to do. This kind of intuition was rare and invaluable. The third pilot selected was Lieutenant David Carter. Carter was a technical specialist. He understood the mechanical aspects of flight in ways that most pilots never bothered to learn. He could diagnose problems with engines by listening to their sound. He could make adjustments to aircraft systems that would make them more efficient. More importantly, Carter could learn the systems of a foreign aircraft more quickly than almost anyone else in the military. And then there was Thomas Webster. Webster was the youngest of the group. He had only just arrived in the Pacific. He barely had 50 flight hours in combat. He was terrified and brave and desperate to prove himself all at the same time. Koller included Webster in the group for a specific reason. He wanted someone who could be shaped, someone who could be molded into the kind of pilot that this operation required. Webster represented the future of aviation. Webster represented the next generation. 10 other pilots rounded out the group. Each had been selected for specific qualities. Each brought something unique to the operation. The group represented the best of American aviation in late 1943. These 12 men arrived at a remote airbase in New Guinea in December 1943. The base was hidden in the jungle. Few people knew about it. Fewer still understood the true purpose of the facility. The pilots were isolated from the rest of the military. They were kept separate. They were told very little about what was coming. When Koller gathered them for the first briefing, the atmosphere was tense. These were warriors about to be told something that would fundamentally change how they understood their role in the war. Koller stood before them and explained in clinical terms what they would be trained to do. They would learn to fly the captured Japanese Zero. They would conduct combat missions in this aircraft. They would encounter actual Japanese pilots. They would engage in aerial combat while flying an enemy aircraft wearing American uniforms. The reality of what Koller was proposing hit them like a physical force. One pilot actually asked if Koller was serious. Another pilot's hands began shaking just thinking about the implications. What if they were shot down? What if they were captured? What if American anti-aircraft crews mistook them for enemy aircraft and opened fire? What if the entire deception collapsed? But none of the pilots walked away. None of them refused. These were men who had already lived through years of combat. These were men who had already faced death multiple times. They understood that the war was being fought on multiple levels, and sometimes that meant accepting impossible risks for the possibility of extraordinary rewards. The training that followed was unlike anything any of these pilots had experienced. It was physically demanding. It was mentally exhausting. It was psychologically disorienting in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The first challenge was learning to fly the Zero itself. This was not a trivial task. The aircraft was fundamentally different from anything these pilots had trained on. The controls were in different places. The instruments were labeled in Japanese, requiring pilots to memorize the locations of critical systems. The electrical systems worked differently. The engine behaved differently. The landing gear operated on different principles. Simply climbing into the cockpit of a Zero and expecting to fly, it was like asking an English speaker to write a novel in Mandarin Chinese without any preparation. Koller brought in American engineers who had spent months studying the captured Zero. These engineers worked with the pilots, explaining every system, every circuit, every mechanical component. They modified the aircraft only minimally, making only those changes necessary to make it flyable by pilots who had no previous experience with Japanese aircraft. English labels were added to critical instruments. Some controls were adjusted to be more intuitive for American pilots. But the aircraft remained fundamentally Japanese. It was still an enemy machine. It still felt wrong to the pilots who climbed into its cockpit. The breakthrough came when Koller made a decision that many military commanders would have considered reckless. He brought in a Japanese pilot. The man's name was Yukihiro Kamikaze. He was a former Japanese naval aviator who had defected to the Americans 2 years earlier. Kamikaze had been living in a secure compound, extensively debriefed, studied by military intelligence officers. Now he was being asked to do something that must have seemed like a betrayal of everything he had been. Koller approached Kamikaze and made him an offer: help train American pilots to fly the Zero and to think like Japanese pilots. In exchange, Koller would ensure that when the war ended, Kamikaze would be treated fairly and would have the opportunity to start a new life. Kamikaze was initially reluctant. But as Koller explained the situation, Kamikaze began to see the logic of it. The war was going to end. Japan was going to lose. The question was whether the war would end quickly or whether it would drag on for months or years, causing suffering to both American and Japanese people. If this operation could help shorten the war, then Kamikaze wasn't betraying his country, he was saving it. Kamikaze agreed, and when he began working with the American pilots, something remarkable happened. Kamikaze taught these men not just how to fly the Zero, but how to think like a Japanese pilot. He explained the philosophy behind Japanese aerial combat. He taught them about the concept of finding opportunity in chaos. He explained how Japanese pilots thought in terms of circles and spirals rather than straight lines and angles. Most importantly, Kamikaze taught them about the psychology of combat. He explained that when you are facing another pilot in aerial combat, you are not facing a machine. You are facing another human being who is just as frightened as you are, just as desperate to survive, just as eager to return home. This understanding would prove to be the most important lesson any of these pilots could learn. The first solo flight in a Zero was a moment of transcendent fear. When Lieutenant James Mills climbed into the cockpit on December 20th, 1943, his heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through his chest. The weather was terrible: clouds hanging low, wind gusting erratically, visibility poor. It was the worst possible conditions for a test flight. Koller wanted to wait, but Mills insisted on going. Mills started the engine. The Mitsubishi Sakai engine roared to life, producing a sound that was distinctly different from the American engines Mills was used to. The vibration was different, the pitch was higher, everything felt wrong, everything screamed that he was climbing into an alien machine. But Mills pushed the throttle forward anyway. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, the tail lifted, the main landing gear came free of the ground. The aircraft rose into the air, and for a moment, Mills experienced pure fear. He was flying an enemy aircraft. If the engine failed, if the aircraft malfunctioned, if something went wrong, he could die right now. But the aircraft climbed. It climbed beautifully. Mills leveled off at 10,000 feet and experienced a moment of pure wonder. The Zero was incredible. It was responsive in ways that American fighters weren't. It was nimble and graceful. It flew like a living thing rather than a machine. Mills spent 30 minutes in the air that day. He climbed to 15,000 feet. He made gentle turns. He tested the engine's performance. He began for the first time to understand why the Zero had been so feared by American pilots. This was not just an aircraft. This was poetry in motion. When Mills landed, he was grinning. He had conquered the beast. He had flown the Zero and lived to tell about it. But more importantly, he had proven that it was possible. If Mills could do it, the other pilots could do it. Over the next 2 weeks, each of the 12 pilots flew the Zero. Each experienced the same mixture of terror and wonder. Each had to overcome the psychological barrier of flying an enemy aircraft. Each had to learn to trust a machine that represented everything they had been trained to destroy. The training sessions became increasingly sophisticated. The pilots practiced maneuvers. They practiced combat formations. They practiced the specific moves that Japanese pilots used in aerial combat. They watched films of aerial engagements. They studied the tactical principles that Japanese pilots employed. But the most intense training came from Kamikaze. He taught them about the Japanese approach to turning combat A technique, where the pilot would bank the aircraft at nearly 90 degrees to the horizon, and maintain that attitude while applying full power. This maneuver was so extreme that American pilots had never attempted it. It required a completely different way of thinking about how to control an aircraft. Young Thomas Webster struggled with this training more than the others. Webster was young and inexperienced. He didn't have the years of flying experience that the other pilots possessed. When Kamikaze demonstrated the extreme turning maneuver, Webster's brain essentially rejected the idea that what he was seeing was physically possible. An aircraft couldn't maintain that kind of attitude and still produce lift. An aircraft couldn't do what Kamikaze was demonstrating, but then Webster watched as Kamikaze did it, and then as Mills did it, and then as Carter did it. Gradually, Webster began to understand that these maneuvers weren't violating the laws of physics. They were simply exploiting principles of aerodynamics in ways that American training had never taught him to think about. One moment changed everything for the young pilot. During a training flight, Webster attempted the turning maneuver at an extreme angle. His brain was screaming at him that the aircraft was going to stall. His body was braced for the spin. His hands were gripping the control stick so hard that his knuckles were white. But the aircraft didn't stall. Instead, it responded to his control inputs with a grace and precision that took his breath away. For a moment, Webster was flying the Zero not as an American pilot in an enemy aircraft, but as a pilot, period. He was flying the machine according to its capabilities, rather than according to his preconceived notions of how an aircraft should behave. Webster emerged from that flight with his confidence transformed. He was no longer afraid of the Zero. He had merged with the machine. He understood it now. He could think like a pilot who had grown up flying this aircraft. April 15, 1944. The day had finally arrived. The 12 pilots had trained for 4 months. They had logged 40 hours each in the Zero. They had studied Japanese tactics. They had learned to think like Japanese pilots. Now it was time to put theory into practice. The sky that morning was grey and threatening. Rain was falling in the distance. Wind was gusting erratically across the airbase. It was not ideal flying weather. Koller considered postponing, but the operation had been delayed 3 times already. If it was delayed a 4th time, there was a risk that the entire operation would be shut down by someone higher up the command chain who didn't understand its significance. The 12 pilots went through their pre-flight routines. They checked every system on their aircraft. They examined the weapons systems. They verified that their American identification documents were secure. They put on their American flight gear and their American dog tags. They were Americans flying enemy aircraft, and they needed to make sure that if anything went catastrophically wrong, there would be evidence of their nationality. The 12 Zero fighters were lined up on the runway. The air around them shimmered with heat haze and exhaust fumes. Ground crews made final adjustments. Officers watched from the control tower. Photographers documented the historic moment, knowing that if the mission succeeded, these photographs would become some of the most classified images of the entire Pacific War. Mills climbed into the lead aircraft. His hands moved through the pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. Start the engine. Verify engine temperature. Check fuel pressure. Verify electrical systems. Test the radio. Everything nominal. Everything ready. Around him, the other 11 pilots were going through the same procedures. Carter in Aircraft 2, Hampson in Aircraft 3, Webster in Aircraft 4, and 8 other pilots in the remaining aircraft. 12 men about to fly into the unknown. Mills pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared. The Zero accelerated down the runway, faster and faster. The end of the runway approached. Mills pulled back on the yoke, and the aircraft lifted off smoothly. Behind him, the other 11 followed in sequence. One by one, the aircraft lifted off the runway. One by one, they climbed into the grey sky. One by one, they formed up in 3 groups of 4 aircraft each, the classic Japanese combat formation. From the ground, it looked like a formation of Japanese fighters, because technically it was exactly that. The flight to the rendezvous point took 2 hours. The aircraft climbed to 15,000 feet. They were above the cloud cover now, with nothing but blue sky above them and clouds below them. The pilots maintained radio silence. The only sounds were the roar of the engines and the rush of air over the fuselage. But then, as they approached the area where they were supposed to rendezvous with an American convoy, the radar operators on the ground detected something that no one had anticipated. 4 Japanese fighters were approaching from the north. 4 genuine Japanese Zero fighters, piloted by genuine Japanese pilots who had no idea that the aircraft they were about to encounter were piloted by Americans. The radar operators reported the contact, and suddenly the training exercise was about to become a real combat situation. Mills received the warning. His heart rate spiked, but his thinking remained clear. The plan was still valid. The American pilots still had a chance to execute the deception. The Japanese pilots didn't know who they were approaching. They would see 4 American-piloted Zero aircraft and would likely assume they were friendly aircraft, possibly from another Japanese unit that they weren't familiar with. Mills made the decision to continue forward. He adjusted the formation slightly to appear more aggressive, as if this was a formation of Japanese fighters returning from a patrol. The 4 approaching aircraft began closing the distance. 200 miles, 150 miles, 100 miles. And then something extraordinary happened. The lead Japanese fighter rocked its wings. The pilot was waving, a gesture of greeting, a signal that acknowledged the presence of friendly aircraft. Mills's pilots waved back. The deception was working. The Japanese pilots genuinely believed they were encountering friendly aircraft. The moment of discovery hadn't come yet. The lie was still alive. But then Mills realized that the Japanese pilots were getting too close. They were moving into a position where they would be able to see details that might give away the deception. An American radar system installed on the wing, an English letter painted on the fuselage. Something that would shatter the lie and transform friendly greeting into hostile confrontation. Mills made a split-second decision. He broke formation. He pushed the throttle to maximum power. He pointed the nose of his aircraft upward at a steep angle. The other 3 aircraft in his group followed his lead. The 4 Japanese pilots, shocked at this sudden change in behavior, immediately realized the truth. These weren't friendly aircraft. This was an attack. They activated their weapon systems and gave chase. What followed was 30 minutes of the most confusing air battle in the history of aerial warfare. American pilots flying Japanese aircraft were being chased by Japanese pilots flying Japanese aircraft. The aircraft were identical, the pilots were different. The outcome was determined by skill and courage and luck, not by superior aircraft design or superior tactics. Captain Robert Hampson, while executing a climbing turn, made a tactical error. His aircraft climbed at too steep an angle. The engine began to lose power. The aircraft stalled. Hampson's body responded with pure instinct. He pushed the control stick forward, trying to regain airspeed, but the aircraft wasn't responding correctly. The Zero entered a spin. Hampson pushed harder on the stick. He adjusted the rudder. He applied everything he had learned in his years of flying. The aircraft came out of the spin just as it descended below 10,000 feet. But Hampson was now in a vulnerable position. He was low, he was slow, he was exactly where a Japanese pilot wanted him to be. One of the Japanese pilots saw the opportunity. He dove on Hampson's aircraft. Tracer rounds from the Japanese fighters' machine guns streaked through the air. Some of the rounds found their target. Hampson's aircraft was hit. The right wing was damaged. The aileron was torn. Smoke began pouring from the engine. Hampson's aircraft became increasingly difficult to control. The right wing was drooping. He was losing altitude rapidly. He was going to have to bail out. He reached up and pulled the ejection handle. The canopy exploded outward. Hampson's body was catapulted from the cockpit. His parachute deployed. He began descending toward the ocean below. The Japanese pilots circled Hampson's crippled aircraft as it spiraled downward. They could shoot at the descending parachute. They could end Hampson's life right now with a few rounds from their machine guns. But they didn't. In that moment, facing an apparently helpless pilot descending toward the sea, the Japanese pilots chose mercy. They circled once more and then headed back north. Back toward their base, satisfied that they had shot down an enemy aircraft. The remaining 11 American pilots watched in horror as Hampson hit the water. But they couldn't go back for him. To do so would be to compromise the entire operation. They had to continue to the rendezvous point. They had to complete the mission. They had to gather the intelligence that Operation Fehler was designed to produce. The American convoy appeared below them, a collection of ships moving slowly through the grey ocean. The pilots flew cover for several hours, occasionally performing simulated attack runs, occasionally engaging with their escort fighters in mock combat. American naval officers watched from their ships, seeing what appeared to be Japanese aircraft attacking them. American fighter pilots engaged what appeared to be enemy aircraft. The entire operation was playing out exactly as planned. But the knowledge that Hampson was in the water, drifting alone in an enemy ocean, gnawed at the pilots' minds. Was he going to be rescued? Would he survive? Had the first mission cost them one of their own? The relief came when the radio crackled with news of the rescue. A Navy patrol boat had located Hampson. He was alive. He was injured, but alive. The moral calculus of war had shifted in that moment. The loss had been mitigated. A pilot who should have died had been saved. Word of the first mission traveled up the chain of command with stunning speed. The military leadership was divided on what had transpired. Some saw it as a brilliant innovation. Others saw it as a dangerous anomaly that could have gone catastrophically wrong. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of American forces in the Southwest Pacific, was among those who were deeply opposed to the operation continuing. MacArthur saw Operation Fehler as a threat to the fundamental structure of military command and control. If American pilots could fly Japanese aircraft, then how would Japanese pilots know who was friendly and who was enemy? This created paranoia. This created confusion. This created the possibility of massive friendly fire incidents. MacArthur demanded that the operation be shut down. He went to his headquarters and issued orders for Operation Fehler to cease immediately. Collar was to be removed from his position. The remaining pilots were to be reassigned to conventional duties. The captured Zero aircraft were to be destroyed. But Admiral Chester Nimitz had a different perspective. Nimitz had authorized the operation in the first place. Nimitz believed that innovation could change wars. Nimitz understood that sometimes the risks of doing something radical were outweighed by the potential benefits. Nimitz intervened. Nimitz overruled MacArthur's decision. Operation Fehler was to continue. The conflict between Nimitz and MacArthur represented a fundamental disagreement about how to conduct modern warfare. MacArthur believed in traditional military organization and conventional tactics. Nimitz believed in flexibility and innovation. In this case, Nimitz's perspective prevailed. But the operation had to change. The first mission had revealed that the Japanese were now alert to the possibility that American pilots were flying captured Zero aircraft. The simple deception of appearing to be friendly wasn't going to work anymore. Japanese pilots were now questioning every Zero they encountered. Japanese commanders were demanding explanations for unexplained aircraft sightings. Kohler made a strategic shift. Instead of trying to fool the Japanese into thinking that these were friendly aircraft, he took a different approach. He had the American pilots openly act like enemies. They would conduct simulated attacks against American convoys. They would execute maneuvers that didn't match the expected behavior of Japanese pilots. They would create chaos and confusion in Japanese air operations. The goal was to gather data. How did American naval crews respond when they came under attack from what appeared to be Japanese aircraft? How did American fighter pilots respond? What tactics worked? What tactics didn't? How could this information be used to improve American air defense? The Japanese, monitoring radio traffic and observing the patterns of aircraft activity, were increasingly confused. They were seeing reports of Japanese aircraft attacking American convoys in areas where Japanese aircraft shouldn't be. They were seeing patterns that didn't match the expected behavior of Japanese air units. Something was wrong. Something didn't fit. Japanese commanders theorized about what could possibly be happening. Some believed that the Americans had indeed captured Japanese aircraft. Some believed that American pilots were flying in Japanese-made aircraft purchased on the black market. Some believed that there was a mole in the Japanese military providing information to the Americans. The paranoia spread like a disease through Japanese air operations. Japanese pilots began questioning every Zero they saw in the sky. Friendly fire incidents increased dramatically. Japanese pilots would shoot at what they thought were American-piloted Zero aircraft, only to discover that they had just shot down their own comrades. The psychological impact of Operation Fehler was becoming more significant than any tactical advantage it could provide. The Japanese were no longer confident in their own aircraft. They were no longer confident in their ability to distinguish friend from foe. They were caught in a nightmare where the very aircraft they depended on had become a source of paranoia and fear. It was on June 10, 1944, that something extraordinary happened. Something so improbable that if it hadn't been documented by multiple witnesses, it might have been dismissed as mythology or legend. Lieutenant James Mills was flying a routine patrol in his Zero fighter. The sky was clear, the clouds below him were sparse. He was cruising at 15,000 feet, his mind settled into the routine of combat patrol. He had flown dozens of these missions now. He had grown accustomed to the rhythm of flight, the sound of the engine, the feel of the aircraft responding to his control inputs. Then he saw it, an aircraft approaching from the south. The aircraft was distinctive. The fuselage was painted red. The markings were unmistakable to anyone who had studied Japanese Air Force insignia. This was the personal aircraft of Saburo Sakai. Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's greatest aces. He had 64 confirmed aerial victories. He was a legend in Japanese aviation circles. He was respected by Japanese pilots and feared by American pilots. Mills immediately realized what was happening. Sakai had spotted what he thought was a fellow Japanese pilot flying a damaged or unusual aircraft. Sakai was approaching to investigate. Sakai wanted to determine if this pilot needed assistance or if there was something unusual about his aircraft that required attention. Mills made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of climbing away and breaking off the encounter, Mills decided to play along. Mills waved at Sakai, and Sakai waved back. For the next 10 minutes, the two greatest pilots in the entire Pacific Theater flew together through the sky. They were separated by only a few hundred feet. They were separated by language, by nationality, by ideology. But they were united by something far more fundamental. They were united by their love of flying and their respect for the art of aerial combat. Sakai tried to establish radio contact, but Mills, realizing that Sakai would immediately recognize that he was speaking English, maintained radio silence. Instead, Mills used hand signals. He pointed ahead, as if indicating a destination. Then he banked sharply to the left and began climbing into the clouds above. Sakai followed for a moment, his curiosity piqued. Then the reality of the situation began to sink in. Something wasn't right. This pilot wasn't responding to radio contact. This pilot wasn't following standard Japanese procedures. This pilot was acting strangely. Sakai began to suspect that something was wrong, but instead of pushing the investigation further, Sakai made a decision that would define his legacy. He broke off the encounter. He banked his aircraft back to the south. He returned to his base. He never reported seeing this mysterious Zero pilot. He never filed a report about the encounter. He never told anyone what he had experienced. Mills disappeared into the clouds. Sakai disappeared toward the south. The two legends separated without ever engaging in combat. The two greatest pilots in the Pacific War passed each other in the sky without firing a single shot. It was a moment of mercy in a war that had known so little mercy. Operation Fehler officially ended in August 1944, after 6 months of operations, after multiple combat missions. After numerous encounters with genuine Japanese pilots, the decision was made to cease the operation. The risks had become too great. The possibility of massive friendly fire incidents had increased. The psychological burden on the pilots had become unbearable. In total, 12 pilots had participated in the operation. 2 had died. Captain Robert Hampson had been shot down in the first mission, though he survived and was rescued, and Lieutenant David Carter had been killed in a training accident several weeks later. 10 pilots returned to their conventional duties, flying American aircraft for the remainder of the war. The operation was immediately classified. Files were sealed. Records were locked away. The pilots were ordered to say nothing about what they had experienced. They were ordered to say nothing about flying Japanese aircraft. They were ordered to say nothing about the missions they had conducted. They were told that Operation Fehler had never happened. Complete denial, total secrecy. The pilots complied. They had no choice. They were military personnel under direct orders. They returned to America. They rebuilt their lives. They got married, they had children. They built careers. They moved on with their lives as if they had never flown an enemy aircraft in combat. But they never forgot. The memory remained with them. The knowledge that they had done something extraordinary, something that no other pilots in the entire world had done, remained embedded in their consciousness. They had become something that had never existed before. They had become American pilots who had lived as Japanese pilots. They had flown in the skin of the enemy and discovered that the enemy was human. The classification remained in place for 51 years. 51 years of secrecy. 51 years of silence, 51 years of a story that no one was allowed to tell. Then, in 1995, the decision was made to declassify the operation. For the first time, the full story was allowed to be told. Books were written, documentaries were produced. Military historians debated the significance of what had happened. Journalists interviewed the surviving pilots, eager to hear their stories. But by this time, many of the pilots had already passed away. James Mills died in 1992. Robert Hampson died in 1998. David Carter was killed in the war. Others had died of natural causes or disease during the intervening decades. The opportunity to hear their stories, to understand what they had experienced, had partially slipped away. Thomas Webster, the youngest pilot in the operation, was one of the few who survived long enough to see the declassification. Webster lived until 2014, reaching the age of 90. When he was in his 90s, Thomas Webster gave his first and only interview about Operation Fehler. He spoke to a journalist about what it had been like to fly a Japanese aircraft. He spoke about the fear he had felt. He spoke about the extraordinary sense of accomplishment when he had succeeded. He spoke about the moment when he had realized that the enemy was human. Webster's words in that interview would define the legacy of Operation Fehler for generations to come. He described the experience as transformative. He described learning that when you flew with someone, when you experienced the same fears and the same joys of flight, nationality became almost irrelevant. What mattered was the skill. What mattered was the courage. What mattered was the love of flying. Operation Fehler is a story about innovation. It is a story about American ingenuity and American pilots pushing the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. It is a story about taking a captured enemy aircraft and turning it into a weapon of psychological warfare. But Operation Fehler is also a story about something far more fundamental. It is a story about what happens when you are forced to understand your enemy so completely that you begin to see them as something other than just an enemy. It is a story about the power of empathy. It is a story about the reality that when you live as your enemy, when you fly their aircraft, when you experience their fears and their joys, you begin to see them as human. The pilots of Operation Fehler learned something that most military leaders never have the opportunity to learn. They learned that the enemy is not some abstract concept. The enemy is a person. The enemy has hopes and dreams. The enemy has fears and desires. The enemy wants to survive and return home, just as you do. This knowledge didn't make the pilots any less effective in combat. In fact, understanding the enemy at this level made them more effective. It made them capable of predicting how the enemy would behave. It made them capable of executing tactics that exploited the enemy's psychological vulnerabilities. But this knowledge also changed them. It made them less comfortable with the abstract nature of war. It made them question the righteousness of their cause. It made them understand that even in war, even in the ugliest circumstances imaginable, human beings remain human. Compassion can exist. Mercy can exist. The possibility of choosing understanding over destruction remains. The encounter between James Mills and Saburo Sakai remains one of the most mysterious moments in the entire history of the Pacific War. No official record of this encounter exists in either American or Japanese military archives. The only documentation comes from Mills's personal memoir, written decades after the war had ended. Mills never revealed the full details of this encounter while the war was still ongoing. He was under orders not to discuss Operation Fehler. But decades later, when the operation had been declassified, Mills wrote about the day when he had seen Saburo Sakai approaching his aircraft. Mills wrote about the moment when two legendary pilots had flown together through the sky, separated by only a few hundred feet, neither one engaging the other in combat. What would have happened if Mills had decided to attack Sakai? What would have happened if Mills had descended and opened fire on Japan's greatest ace? Mills could have potentially shot down one of Japan's most skilled pilots. Mills could have become a hero in American military circles. Mills could have changed the course of the aerial war in the Pacific. But Mills didn't attack. Mills chose a different path. Mills chose to acknowledge the presence of another pilot who shared his love of flying. Mills chose to respect the legacy of a man who had dedicated his life to the art of aerial combat. Mills chose mercy over murder. This choice defined Mills's entire legacy. After the war, Mills never spoke about this encounter in interviews. He never sought recognition or fame based on what might have happened if he had attacked Sakai. Mills simply lived his life, content with the knowledge that he had made a choice that felt right in that moment. Saburo Sakai survived the war. Sakai continued flying combat missions until the very end of the war in the Pacific. After the war, Sakai moved to a small farm in rural Japan. Sakai lived quietly, away from the public eye. Sakai died in 2000, never knowing that the mysterious Zero pilot he had encountered in June 1944 was an American flying a captured Japanese aircraft. The encounter between Mills and Sakai remains a symbol of what war could be if mercy prevailed over hatred. It remains a symbol of the possibility of human connection even in the midst of armed conflict. It remains a testament to the fact that even in the deadliest circumstances, even in aerial combat at 30,000 feet, we are still capable of recognizing another human being. The pilots who survived Operation Fehler carried the weight of this secret for over 50 years. They could not tell their families. They could not tell their friends. They could not tell journalists or historians or anyone else who asked about their military service. They had to live with the knowledge that they had done something extraordinary, something that changed their understanding of warfare and of human nature itself, and they had to remain silent about it. This silence took a toll. Some of the pilots experienced what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The psychological burden of flying enemy aircraft, of encountering genuine enemy pilots, of not knowing whether their own side would shoot them down, left marks that never fully healed. Thomas Webster, in his 90-year interview, spoke about the weight of silence. He spoke about how difficult it had been to keep this secret for decades. He spoke about how his family had never understood why he seemed different after his return from the Pacific. He spoke about the internal struggle between his pride in what he and his fellow pilots had accomplished and his confusion about whether what they had done was right or wrong. But Webster also spoke about the moment when the classification was lifted. He spoke about the relief he felt when he was finally allowed to tell his story. He spoke about the sense of validation he felt when historians and military strategists began to recognize the significance of Operation Fehler. He spoke about the understanding that came when the world finally knew what he and his fellow pilots had accomplished. Webster died in 2014, knowing that his story would be remembered, knowing that the world would eventually understand what Operation Fehler had meant, knowing that the sacrifice he and his fellow pilots had made would not be forgotten. Operation Fehler remains one of the most extraordinary military operations in the history of aerial warfare. It taught military strategists and historians several crucial lessons about warfare, innovation, and human nature. First, Operation Fehler demonstrated that innovation in warfare can come from unexpected places. A captured enemy aircraft and the mind of one unconventional officer were sufficient to create a completely new operational capability. Collar's willingness to think outside conventional military doctrine led to the development of something that changed how military leaders understood the possibilities of air combat. Second, Operation Fehler demonstrated that understanding your enemy is far more valuable than simply defeating your enemy. The pilots who learned to fly the Zero didn't just gain an advantage in aerial combat. They gained an understanding of how Japanese pilots thought, how they approached problems, how they made decisions. This understanding was worth far more than any tactical victory could have been. Third, Operation Fehler demonstrated that humanity persists even in the most inhumane circumstances. Even in aerial combat, even when death is only seconds away, even when your enemy is trying to kill you, compassion can exist. Mercy can exist. The possibility of recognizing another human being remains. Most importantly, Operation Fehler demonstrated that wars are fought by human beings, not by machines. The aircraft are merely tools. What matters is the skill and courage and character of the people flying them. What matters is the understanding that the person on the other side of the sky is just as human as you are, just as frightened, just as desperate to survive. Operation Fehler is a story that should be remembered. It should be remembered not just as a military operation that worked, but as a moment when American pilots learned something fundamental about themselves and about their enemies. The 12 men who participated in this operation showed a kind of courage that goes far beyond what is typically required in combat. They volunteered to fly enemy aircraft into battle. They volunteered to live a lie. They volunteered to place themselves in situations where one small mistake could result in their death. They volunteered to understand their enemy so completely that they became, for a time, their enemy. They did this for their country. They did this for their fellow soldiers and sailors who were fighting and dying across the Pacific. But they also did this because they were curious. They were willing to push boundaries. They were willing to ask what if, when others were content to follow established procedures. The legacy of Operation Fehler is not just military, it is human. It is a reminder that even in war, even in the darkest circumstances, we retain the capacity to see each other as human. We retain the capacity for mercy. We retain the capacity for understanding. This is a story that should never be forgotten. This is a story of Americans who became Japanese pilots, who learned to think like the enemy, who discovered that the enemy was human. This is a story of innovation and courage and compassion in the midst of war.